Thank you, President. And I'd like to give your eyes a small break from looking at images on the screen and just concentrate on your ears, on your hearts. So taking the sense of Anthropocene generally as anthropogenic, as a human impact on the world and environment, I'd just like to observe that shortly after His Holiness, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, had described the abusive treatment of creation and the earth in terms of sin, Pope Francis wrote his encyclical letter Laudato Si on the care of our common home to address the current ecological crisis, both natural and human. Not only in our environment, not only is our environment globally deteriorating, but little effort is also made to safeguard the moral conditions of an authentic human ecology. So the destruction of the human environment, Pope Francis observed, is extremely serious, not only because God has entrusted the world to us, men and women, but because human life is itself a gift, which must be defended from various forms of debasement. So that is why celebrating the feast of St. Joseph shortly after he was named a pope, Pope Francis decided to invite all of humanity with a cry of protecting two fragilities in our midst: creation, our environment, and the poor in our midst. He himself devotes an encyclical to these fragilized works of God creation, not, as he says, to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware and to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and so discover what each of us can do about it. So the human person cannot be indifferent to the lot of these two fragilities, our environment or creation and the poor in our midst. For every effort to protect and improve our world entails profound changes in lifestyle, models of production and consumption, and the established structure of power which today governs societies. So the human person and his culture are so central to the ecological crisis. And we may then enter the question, how may we then evaluate the place of the human person in the blend of concerns which Laudato Si presents in integral ecology and which for us constitute Anthropocene, or the topic of discussion? For me, it's a question of relationship. The relationship between humanity, the human person, and its environment or the world in which he lives. And so looking at this, I like to observe that the outbursts of ecological consciousness and interest that characterized the 70s found expression variously in the organizations and summits on the level of the United Nations, in studies in academic institutions and universities, and in centers of popular green movements. Universities began to dedicate chairs, colleges, and departments to environmental studies, dealing with it purely so as a Department of Environmental Studies, but the academic interest in the environment also took the form of a study of the relationship between the environment and the human presence within it. This gave rise to the creation in universities of departments of human ecology for the study of the impact of the human person on his environment, or the human person in his environment as an instance of evolutionary adaptation to the space it lives in. Sometimes this degenerated into several interdisciplinary letters now. Governments also began to respond to the concern about the environment through the creation of environmental protection agencies, and beginning with its conference on the human environment in Stockholm in 1972, the United Nations has consistently dedicated attention to the environmental question in subsequent conferences. Now, since its meeting in Johannesburg in 2002, the United Nations also consistently relates the question of the environment with the question of human development. And the current United Nations SDG goals, SDGs, are, according to the former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, not only a narrative about development and the protection of the environment, they are also a human dignity narrative that leaves no one behind. So the relationship between the environment and the human person within it is a thing of constant interest and ultimately underlies the definition of an Anthropocene. The United Nations Secretary General's formulation of the relationship between the protection of the environment and human dignity, so for development, affirms not only the physical interrelatedness of humanity with its physical environment, it also affirms the interdependence of their destinies, their lot, and their well-being. By the description of the nature of this interdependence, and interrelatedness is a thing that's of ongoing discussion. Some centers of higher education influenced by the evolutionary scheme of things have referred to human ecology as a question of the survival of the fittest, as it were, how human beings adapt to their environment. Others describe the relationship between the human person and his environment in terms of human ecology, which takes the form of an interdisciplinary pursuit that studies how the human person and his environment mutually affect each other. But there are other studies that present the presence of the human species as a menace to the environment. And related to this position are two noteworthy developments. The first was the presentation of the limits of the Earth's resources as an issue of human ecology. This was the tenor of the works of Paul Ehrlich and Anne Ehrlich in their Population Bomb, Population Resources, Environment, Issues on Human Ecology, and so on. The population explosion of Ehrlich's position invited to consider human demography as a threat to the environment, as just observed in a question by Professor William. It was taken up in 1970 by an MIT team of 17 researchers, the fruit of whose study was entitled The Limits to Growth. That study analyzed the limits of our world system and their constraints on human growth and activity. This study was presented in Rio de Janeiro already in 1971, and finally ended up here at the Club of Rome, where it was adopted in 1972 as a report of the club's project on the predicament of mankind. The second related development of the outburst of the ecological consciousness of the 1970s and an attempt to situate and define human presence within it was the positing, some 30 years later, of an Anthropocene epoch to describe a proposed new epoch in the Quaternary period when human actions have a drastic effect on the Earth. Professor Paul Joseph Turkson, a researcher in atmospheric chemistry, about the ozone layer and all, a Nobel Prize winner and then a member of this academy, as has been observed, was the avid proponent of this definition. According to him then, it's already been presented scientifically now in the talks before this, but according to him, the sheer scope of human activities and their impact on essential planetary processes have become so profound as to drive the Earth out of the Holocene epoch in which agriculture, sedentary communities, and eventually social and technologically complex human societies have developed, and to call for the use of a new geological term, which is what we are talking about here. And this has become, according to Donna Haraway, this has become a mandatory concept in framing, thinking about, and ultimately facing accelerating environmental and multi-species catastrophe. And so in a subsequent study, Trajectories of the Earth System in the Anthropocene by Will Stefan, Johan Rockstrom, and his colleagues, 14 of them, other scholars, the extent and the intensity of human impact on the world, on the world's ecosystem, which underlies Turkson's Anthropocene, is revisited as self-reinforcing feedbacks that could push the Earth, that could push the Earth system towards a plenary threshold that, if crossed, could prevent stabilization of the climate at intermediate temperature rises, and cause continued warming on a hothouse Earth, regardless of reduction in human emissions. But Paul Turkson's Anthropocene also shared an anthropological concern, which the report of the Club of Rome wrestled with under the heading of predicament of mankind. Can humanity be a menace to its own world and its own environment? This, at the end of the day, is the discussion and the debate. For Paul Turkson, not only do many human activities impact on the Earth's environment, often surpassing nature with ecological, atmospheric, chemical, and even climatic consequences, but growing human populations are burdensome to the environment. They are accompanied by their great need for food, for water, improved living conditions, and land use. And so indeed, there has been, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, a growing disturbance, expression he uses, a growing disturbance of the Earth's natural system by human activities, which has created precisely a new geological era called the Anthropocene. So human impact has so intensified since the onset of industrialization as to take us out of the Earth system state typical of the Holocene epoch that postdates the last glaciation. All of this means for me that at the core of Turkson's Anthropocene lies the affirmation that human beings can change the Earth in such profound and lasting ways that they usher in a new chapter in its own history. A new geological epoch of human beings can be introduced by human beings themselves, as it were. Effectively, then, Turkson's hypothesis means that human activity now rivals geological forces in influencing the trajectory of the Earth system, and this, according to Will Stefan and his colleagues, has important implications for both Earth systems science, Earth system science, and societal decisions making, disrupting the ecosystem and the society and its economic system, and one can briefly already begin to think about the AIs. So finally, Cruton's hypothesis enforces a global threat, which calls for a global stewardship of the entire Earth system, the biosphere, the climate, ecosystems, and societies, involving behavioral change, transformation of social values, technology, innovation, and good governance. And the call of science for stewardship of the entire Earth system coincides with the religious call from the patriarch and from Pope Francis about the aboriginal mandate of the human race, which I shall now briefly present as defining the place of humankind in creation. For, in the words of Professor Ramanathan, a member of this academy who unfortunately is not here, there is a foundational alliance between science and faith. And if the considerations of science call for stewardship of creation, so does religious consideration and study of religious literature also do the same. And so defining the place of the man in his creation quickly, I just like to observe that the first strokes and the strikes of scriptures or the Bible is the church's understanding of the place of the human person in creation. And from the biblical accounts, there in the first account of creation, human person belongs to a created nature. The environment of human existence is also part of this creation. And the environment then was presented as the work of God's word and by design. The first instance of God speaking to the world was actually at the creation of the world, and it was to transform chaos at the dawn of creation into a cosmos, an ordered world system capable of supporting human life and suitable to be a home for the human species. Subsequently, God created a human person and created him male and female in his image and likeness, and to have dominion over everything that God has created. Just as Adam is distinct from the rest of creation by reason of his nature, created in the image and likeness of God, so is he also distinct in his relationship with the rest of creation by reason of exercising dominion over it, and the exact sense of this is so sometimes discussed and disputed. In the second account of creation we read about from Genesis chapter 2 and 3 and 4, it's a God fashioned an earth home suitable for the human species, which was described as a garden planted by God. And here, according to the scripture account, God placed the human person whom he had formed out of the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils. And so the earth, as it were, is a garden home planted by God, precisely because it's an environment that promotes and supports human existence and human life. For man then to be abusive and destructive of this garden home then becomes a challenge. So, created out of the dust, but distinct from the dust by reason of bearing the breath of God and within it, the human person, man, is introduced into this garden planted by God, and he was to till and to keep it. Two expressions which I like to talk about a little bit, not because I want to do a class of Hebrew here, but because I want to draw some details. The dominion over creation and the work of Adam is referred to as tilling and keeping. The Hebrews use the word avad to till or work, and shamar to keep. Avad, however, is not simply to work. It's also the same word that is used for cult and worship. And that gives a sense of man's working the earth as a reverential treatment or reverential treatment of the earth. Not any form of abusive treatment of the earth, but to treat the earth reverently, as it were, as if it was worship of God himself. The second expression about keeping the earth shamar is also the same word that was used between Cain and Abel, his brother, whom he killed. And he says, am I my brother's keeper? And so to also keep the earth is to observe a broader relationship, as it were, between humanity and the garden home that is entrusted to his care. All of this leads us to formulate a conduct of human person in his garden home as a reverential working of the earth and a brotherly keeping of the earth as if he was a brother, as if he was a kinsman of some sort. This account in scriptures was written several years before Francis of Assisi was born, but it reflects what Francis of Assisi will later on celebrate as a relationship, a kinship relationship between himself and creation. Brother, son, sister earth, everything in a kinship relationship. This, at the end of the day, I think is what all of this calls for. And so, way of concluding, celebrating in this aula, sin of Anthropocene, in which we reflect about the impact of the human person on creation, the sense tends to be negative, and that poses the question, how can the human person be a menace to his own garden home, which was planted to support and to sustain his own life? And this calls for the same thing about reverential working the earth and keeping the earth as if it was a king, as if it was a kinsman, as if it was a brother. In that sense, we come to Pope Francis's own conclusion. To be able to do this, he invites us to do three things. He invites us to exercise ecological conversion, change of lifestyle, change of attitude, change of way of treating the earth, and make the earth live as a brother. Second thing he invites us to do is ecological education to become ecological citizens. So to put ourselves to ecological education to become ecological citizens, not by way of gathering information about the earth, but by way of also inculcating positive conducts about how to treat and deal with the earth. And with this, I want to thank you for your kind attention.